Welcome, everyone. We're excited to see all of you here this evening for our speaker series. We are very, very pleased to have William H. White, Bill, my friend, the gentleman in the doorway there, here to share with us his experience of, he's got a lot of experience in plugging interesting fictional characters into very exciting historical events. And he has chosen to write about the wreck of the Ten Sail, which is a special event that happened here in the Cayman Islands 220 years ago, actually, this 8th of February, if you will. So Bill and I met a few years ago. I had done a PhD dissertation on the wreck of the Ten Sail, and he happened to find it in the National Archive here, and he can maybe tell you a little bit about that. So what he's asked me to do is he asked me, even though this is Bill's show, to give you a little nutshell overview of the history of the wreck of the Ten Sail. So in a short time, I'm going to just go over that information for you. Basically, this is the East End Reef of Grand Cayman. Most of you are familiar with it. In this several mile stretch, there are more than 30 shipwrecks, and 10 of them wrecked, on the 8th of February in 1794, and it became known as the wreck of the Ten Sail. Now, how did people, how was information found about this that happened so long ago, when locally on the island, people were just calling it the wreck of the Ten Sail and didn't really, use names and that sort of thing? Well, you can go to archives in England, Jamaica, and France, and information was in all these locations. Oral history in the Cayman Islands, chatted with a lot of the older local people, and there were some elements of the story that did sort of jiving with the historical record. But there were also people who knew where physical remains were in the sea, so it was really, really valuable. But the folklore part of it had a lot to do with, the value of folklore on the island. And then archaeology, as you can see here, that little thing that looks like a little mass of coral is really a cannonball. There's ceramics and, even dishes and that sort of thing. Now, what was the time period? Well, the time period was the French Revolutionary Wars, and they lasted between 1792 to 1802. Of course, there were more wars after that, but there was a brief lull at that point. At this time, France was at war with just about everybody, and one of the countries they were at war with, of course, was Great Britain, probably the greatest rival to France at that time. So France had declared war on Austria in 1792, and by early 1793, they declared war on Great Britain. Well, as soon as that news reached Jamaica, which, I don't have a little pointer here, but if Jamaica is here, the red island on the left, and on the right, where Haiti is in sort of a pink color, that was Saint-Domingue. That was the major French colony. I just happened to have it on two different maps. Anyway, the British in Jamaica had a peacetime squadron located there. There were about 9 ships in that squadron. But when the news came from Europe and they learned that war had been declared, it was like, whoopee, this is really good. This is what naval officers and seamen liked, because this was when you could start making money. You could capture your enemy ships, and it was very lucrative to do so. So as soon as the news arrived, ships from Jamaica sailed to what is Haiti, but was Saint-Domingue. And when they got there, they troubled the shipping there, capturing a number of merchant ships. And one of the first naval vessels that they captured was a beautiful frigate, and her name was L'Inconstante. And she had a lot of trouble on board. Remember, this is the time of the French Revolution, and there was, the colonies in the Caribbean. There was uprisings, and it was a very tumultuous time and a period in history, which, in the long run, ultimately, the situation in Haiti ended up making that country the first republic in the whole Caribbean. So, it was just tumultuous. But anyway, 2 British frigates managed to capture L'Inconstante, and they sailed her back to Jamaica. And because the British Navy already had a ship called the Inconstant in their Navy, they renamed her, and her name became HMS Convert. Now, the merchants in Jamaica were really, really pleased to see the Convert, because they had been told by the the Admiralty, essentially, that there was not enough ships on the station to lead a convoy back to Europe at this time of year, and there were a good number of ships that wanted to carry rum, and lumber and sugar and that sort of thing back to Europe, and they wanted to be protected because they did not want to get captured by other French ships. So anyway, the ships on the southeast coast of Jamaica, right there is Port Royal, and so the first job was to, the mission was given to the Convert frigate to lead the convoy back to Europe, and this was going to give the British a good chance to re-outfit this beautiful French ship, if you will, to use in the service. But the ships did leave Port Royal on the southeast coast of Jamaica. They sailed along the coast up towards the south. It's still the southwest to Bluefields. Then they went up to off the end, Long Bay, off of the Long Bay, and a few ships from the north met them. And then they sailed because they were going back to Europe, right? Well, anyway, the Convert was heading them up. She was the only naval ship with the convoy. There were 55 ships that were intended for ports in Europe, and there were 3 ships intended for ports actually that were going to drop off along the U.S. And so you see they intended to go by that dotted line from Jamaica, south of the Cayman Islands, around Cape Corrientes in Cuba, through the passage, and then back onto Europe. Well, sometimes things don't go exactly as planned. And what happened in this case is the Convert had been given instructions to keep with the slowest sailing ship. And so she was a fast frigate, but she had troubles in terms of the convoy. There was one leaky ship that had delayed the convoy on 2 occasions. So late, in the evening on the 7th of February, after the Convert had stopped twice, but was intending to, thinking, what is my position now? Captain Lawford conferred with the sailing master, Popplewell, and Popplewell thought that they needed to haul a little bit more to the northward to not miss making Cape Corrientes on the coast of Cuba. And they pricked it off on the chart, and they were happy about that. And Lawford, after being awake for probably months, went to bed. Well, anyway, what happened is, of the fleet of 59 ships, the frigate and 58 merchant ships, 10, that whole top row, plowed into the east end of Grand Cayman. So this is Captain Lawford a few years later. He was only 40 years old, roughly 40 years old when he was involved in the wreck of the 10 Sail. And he did live to be 86, and he did make it to be an admiral, so he ended up having a successful career later. But anyway, on this particular day, the dawning of the day presented a most melancholy scene, with 7 ships and 2 brigs on the same reef as the Convert, a heavy sea running and the wind blowing directly on shore. It was a mess. He wrote letters to the Admiralty. He sent messages out to the ships offshore to try to take on the survivors, because the people on the island presented to him that they'd had a hurricane in the final months of 1793, and so they convinced him to try to get most of the people off. But in the meantime, the Convert at the top there, John Lawford, there were probably a little over 200 people on the ship when it wrecked. I think about 5 people perished, in the disaster. And then these are the nine of the merchant ships, and all of those names were found in a newspaper account in the archives at Kew in the UK. It was like the whole trip was worth just knowing that. So anyway, then the Lawford's men, Lawford's officers and 30 of his best men camped at the east end of Grand Cayman. Lawford did walk with several men along the whole south coast to the Hogsties, which is Georgetown here. Messages had been sent offshore to some of the ships that were in the offing, and 9 of the ships heeded the direction, and they did sail around, and they did take people back to Europe. So is there anything left there? Well, just a quick here for you to see. That probably just looks like coral rubble. But in reality, the metal detector person there is finding a piece of standing rigging, which held up the line, the chain plates, which held up the mast. Anyways, right there, and then I think that's probably a sword handle. This is an anchor that we believe is associated with the wreck of the Ten Sail.
Now you flipped by that. Just back up.
Okay.
That diver at the far end of the anchor is our speaker.
Well, you wouldn't know it.
Well, it was fun. It was an adventure, I tell you. Anyway, the smoking gun, however, literally here, was the French cannons that we found, in the buried in the sandbar at the east end of the island. And I also found 10 of them that people had lifted out of the sea, unfortunately. These cannons have the date, the 12-pounder cannons and 6-pounder cannons. The 12-pounders, it means that they fired a cannonball that weighed 12 pounds. And so most of the guns aboard the Long Constant, come HMS Convert, were 12-pounders. And so these were forged in 1781, and they have little fleur-de-lis on them. That was a symbol that they were intended for Rochefort off the coast of France. The BA on the trunnion means that they were forged by a man named Baynaud, and he had a forge. It was called Forge Neuve, and it was at the end of the River Charente on the coast of France, where where the Long Constant sailed from. So we think we have some. We think we got her. Anyway, we did do 20 years ago, it's hard to believe that it's been that long ago, but we did do a special exhibit at the National Museum. The Currency Board did a special coin. The Philatelic Bureau published stamps, both merchantman and the convert. And we published a little book that you can buy in the shop for $12. Which really, it has a lot of the historical documents. We published this so that the school children would have something that was accessible, but it's really very, very user-friendly. So with that little nutshell, I'm going to turn it over to our illustrious maritime historian and author, Bill White, and my friend.
That long blonde-haired lady in the white suit there is Dr. Denton. Greeting Queen Elizabeth.
In my wedding dress, no less.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you just heard the history, the real history. I want to talk about, and this is something new for me, because I normally, when I do a talk of this nature, I talk about the history. But since we had probably the foremost expert in the free world right here directing the museum and setting up this program, it seemed logical that she should do the serious history on it, which is what you just had. What I'm going to do is talk about taking an historical event and turning it into a novel. But before I do that, I have to thank Dr. Denton, and I have to thank her staff here for organizing this, and also for getting her PhD, because if she hadn't written that, I would have probably still been doing research. So, the dates of the events are set. They're set in concrete. I can't change them. So I have to make decisions as to how I'm going to tell this story without messing with the history and without changing dates or outcomes or what have you. So I have to make decisions. I have to determine who will narrate the story. How does he get to Jamaica? Well, he's got to be British, so he's got to get to Jamaica from England. How does Convert become a member of the Royal Navy? We already heard that story, but I have to make sure that I cover that in the story. And how does the narrator get into Convert? Now remember, the narrator is a fictional character. So I just fill in the gaps. Okay. My previous book which was the only book that I'd done prior to this one that included the Royal Navy or involved the Royal Navy, was called When Fortune Frowns, and little plug for the book. And the narrator in that book was a fictional character that I created named Edward Ballantyne, who sailed in this story after the bounty mutineers in HMS Pandora in the late 1780s. So would he have been able to get back to England, deal with a court-martial, spend a little bit of time ashore, and then get himself to Jamaica in time to sail in February of 1794 in Convert? And Lord be praised, it worked. So he's going to go out on HMS Europa, which was a real 50-gun ship that sailed from England at that time to come to Jamaica to be Admiral Ford's flagship. However, before I could put him on that ship, I had created a little bit of a monster for myself. One of the things that writers do from time to time is, if they're involved with a charity, they'll put up a character to be named by a bidder at an auction. And in the particular case of this book that I was working on, Gun Bay, I was asked by an organization that was maritime historically organized to put up a character for auction at their big annual dinner fundraiser, which I was happy to do. And this would be about the fourth or fifth time in 8 books that I've done this. And one gentleman got going with the bidding, and it was fairly active, and he wound up winning it for a rather substantial contribution to the organization. And he came up to me afterwards and he said, "That price I paid is for 2 characters." And they're both women. I practically swallowed my gum, because there aren't a lot of women in my stories. They take place on ships at sea, and in those days we weren't politically correct enough to send our women to sea in warships. So I had to figure out how to put these 2, there was daughters, put these 2, and they were grown women, into the story. And so I kept Edward in England for a year after he finished with the bounty court-martial, before he shipped out on Europa. And the tragedy of this, and I'll share this with you just because it's kind of stunning to me. The book came out in July, and I sent the chap who had bid half a dozen copies as he had requested. I billed the organization for them. And I never heard from him how his daughters enjoyed their characters, how it went over. Because, and has anybody here besides me read this book? A few people, okay. Well, if you recall, in the kind of the dream sequence in the early part of the book, one of the young ladies is kind of to the manner born, speaks properly, is well educated. The other one is a barmaid. And they are, in fact, in the story, sisters as they are in real life, and those are their real names. So I called up the organization after I'd sent the books off, and I didn't hear anything back for quite a while. And I said, did this fellow respond to you in any way on these? Oh, dear God. I don't know whether he's even read them or not. His wife died the week after the book came out. It gets worse. 6 weeks later, one of the girls that was in the book died. of cancer, both of them. So I stopped asking. So anyway, fortunately, I didn't have to put that into the book. But so we got Edward now a year after he comes back from the trial, and he's on Europa heading to Jamaica. And this is what a 50-gun ship looks like from an artist's painting, obviously. Now, I should tell you in fairness, that is HMS Leopard. It is not HMS Europa, but they were the same size ships, rigged the same way, and for all intent and purposes, they look pretty much the same. The Leopard played a major role in the start of the War of 1812, so, and that's really my forte, so I happen to have this in my files. So, at the time that Edward gets to Port Royal, to Jamaica, after having his adventures on Europa and going through some storms and so forth, the French frigate had not yet been captured. So he was assigned in Penelope, which was one of the two British ships that actually captured L'Inconstant. My French is worse than my English. And so he had to kind of cool his heels on Europa and ashore, waiting for his ship to come back in. And so I figured, let's tell the story of the capture of the ship. So I did the research on that, and we got the ship captured. And the people, those of you that have read it, and hopefully those of you who will, the story of the capture of the French frigate is correct. It is not fabricated history. The players, for the most part, at least the ships and the captains of the ships and their first officers, are real. And they came back in to Port Royal in convoy, if you will, after repairing the damage at sea. So we get to Port Royal, and as you saw on the larger map that Peggy had, this is kind of on the south east coast of Jamaica, and Port Royal was an interesting place. There's so many stories that have been written about Port Royal, pirates and what have you. In the 17th century, it was the absolute haven in the Caribbean for pirates. It was a wild, wide open town that anything goes. And those of you that saw any of the Johnny Depp movies, some of those were reported to have taken place in Port Royal. So while I've got Edward in Port Royal hanging out, I can play. I can tell stories about Port Royal. I can give you, the reader, a tour of Port Royal. This, by the way, is the sister ship of L'Inconstant. This is La Unité, which was built at the same time to the same lines and scantlings. Unfortunately, that's all we got. So we're now in Port Royal. This is a close-up. This is the town of Port Royal here, and the Navy Yard, the British Navy Yard. You can't say a thing, can you?
A little, yeah.
It's a good thing I lost weight. Fort Charles is probably the mainstay of Port Royal. It is a very large fort that was actually, it was inhabited at one point by Admiral Lord Nelson, not as an admiral. And as you can see in this picture, it's right up against the sea. It was built in 1756 by the British. Unfortunately, there was an earthquake in 1692, thank you, historian, that dropped the land on one side of Port Royal and raised it on the other. So by the time the earthquake was all done, this was where you were just seeing the sea. this was raised land here. So this wall here had been up against the sea. It was now unraised land. There was, the people probably thought Port Royal was jinxed because they had an earthquake. Following that, they had a tidal wave. Following that, a few years later, after they rebuilt, they had a terrible, terrible hurricane. And then they had a fire. I think your microphone, can you hear it still? Pause the program.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Is it all right?
Yeah, it's all right.
Okay. So anyway, the people in Port Royal, the Navy continued to stay there. They built a hospital at the Navy base. This is, I'm told, going to be renovated in the next year or so. Knowing how things work in the Caribbean, it might be before I die, hopefully. But this is all still there. These are actual photographs. So we sail off on the convoy. Ballantyne, of course, gets on board through a series of machinations. I used a couple of writer's ploys to meet some new characters, describe life in Jamaica. This takes place at Christmas time, so there had to be, in those days it wasn't a holiday party, it was a Christmas party at a plantation for the naval officers that were in town, if you will. And some machinations that went on there, and got the second officer in Convert, unfortunately, killed. And Edward got the job. So he gets on Convert, they get sailing orders. He goes around to the fleet with some of the midshipmen and explains to the merchant captains what the sailing orders are and how to stay in formation, stay behind the Convert, which will be sailing at the rate of the slowest ship, as Peggy said. Some of them were less than cooperative, and they were testing Convert as quickly as they came out of Port Royal and were trying to get ahead of her and so forth. So, as you heard from Peggy briefly a little bit, 10 minutes ago, 15 minutes ago, they got the reef in the dark, and it wasn't because the weather was bad. The weather was perfectly acceptable. It was dark. It frequently is at 2 o'clock in the morning. But there was a northerly current. Now, a current runs in the direction, a west wind comes from the west, west current runs to the west. This was a north current that was setting them to the north faster than they realized. It had been overcast. They had not gotten good position, accurate position. And then the problem became with some of the merchant ships having got ahead of Convert. They got onto the reef. They fired cannon as a danger signal. A couple of ships turned around. One of them turned around right into Convert, knocking her off course. It was a bad scene. And as Peggy alluded, when the sun came up, here were 7 ships, 2 brigs, and a Royal Navy frigate on the harbor, and sea running, the wind blowing directly toward the shore. And it was categorized in the correspondence as a melancholy sight. And I can tell you it must have been. So they got ashore. Several people got killed, but it was not the wholesale slaughter that it could have been. They got ashore has anybody been down to Gun Bay and know the inside the reef there? It's very shallow. I mean, we're talking 15 feet, 20 feet max, and then it shoals up very quickly toward the shore. It was not that, maybe half a mile to the reef. So it wasn't that far, and it was fairly calm in the water, so they could get boats in, and they got ashore, and the locals, in spite of the fact that in October, before this, they had a devastating hurricane that made Ivan look like a summer breeze. For those of you that remember Ivan. And the island was virtually wiped out. The people's livelihood, their homes, their livestock, their crops, everything. And they, but they had built some new boats, and they come out and help the survivors get off the ships and come ashore. So there's all these people on the beach. Now, this seawall wasn't there then, but they did come in where there was a sandy beach, which is still there. But after they realized that they had to get to Hogstyes, Georgetown, just right out here, to get help and get on with their lives, they walked on the Iron Shore. And those of you who've driven along that road there along the shore, this is pretty much what you got. And it's 25 miles because I clocked it in my car. I did not walk it. And I wouldn't want to walk 25 miles on that. I don't like to walk 10 feet on it. But they did, and they got to Hogstyes. As Peggy said, they had sent some ships, some notes out to some of the ships that were sailing on and off outside the reef. And they came to Hogstyes. They collected some of them. They came back. They brought them back to Gun Bay. They collected as many of the survivors as they could fit in. And off they go back to Jamaica. The remainder of the merchant ships carried on, and at the conclusion of the whole thing, the Admiralty sent a warship here to basically, when they got the word in Jamaica that there had been this disaster, they sent a warship to see what was going on, what they could do to help, and who they were going to hang, which, you know, is kind of normal. So, as it turns out, and you heard Peggy say that Captain Lawford lived a long life, dying in his 80s at the rank of admiral. So while a grounding and a shipwreck for most people would be kind of damaging to your career plan, for him, it didn't seem to have a great deal of bearing on it. And interestingly, and one of the things that I liked about the character that I used, Edward Ballantyne, was that in his previous existence, and When Fortune Frowns, he had been shipwrecked off Australia. So, and that again was a true story. So, Peggy mentioned that they had several cannon, a dozen or so, that the locals had pulled out from the lagoon and used to decorate their front lawns. I would say that the conservation of that was somewhat limited. But you can, there's several of them along the road there. And Edward made it obviously back to England so that he could appear in my next book. And that's a very large copy of what it looks like, and you can't get out without the commercial. I thank you for your attention. I would be happy to answer questions if anybody has them. And we have the star historian here that can answer the history questions that I can't answer. Yes, sir.
So was Cayman a British holding at that point?
Yes. Well, pretty much.
Under Jamaica.
It was part of the Jamaican protectorate.
We were part of the territories of Jamaica, so yes, we were.
What happened to the other fictional daughter?
Sorry?
What happened to the other fictional daughter? One died.
Real life, we're saying.
Well, the fictional characters. One of them I had to kill off to get Edward into Convert. So the rest of them, they were fictional. They just passed through. That's one of the nice things about writing fiction. Yes, sir.
How many people actually came ashore?
Oh my, there must have been 700 or 800 of them, right?
Maybe a little less than that. The frigate would have had just over 200.
Well, the frigate did, but I'm thinking of the other
The
nine
merchant
ships.
ships probably had maybe 20 people max on
Well,
board.
a lot of them had passengers. Anyway,
some passengers.
anywhere from 500 to 700 people, I would say, were ashore. It was pretty crowded, yes, sir.
What was the primary product that they were bringing back?
Ships came from all over the Caribbean. I would say sugar primarily.
Sugar, lumber, cotton, and wood, I think.
Coming out of
Wood.
Jamaica. I don't think that any of them came up from Barbados with Mount Gay rum.
Yeah, it was mostly perishable cargoes. And one of the merchant ship captains, the captain of the Britannia,
Right.
did die in the disaster.
There is in this wonderful little book, which I would absolutely recommend if you choose not to buy gun bag, well, okay, but this is the real history. And I would very much commend this to your attention because
I both of them.
you buy both of them, the museum
It's a
needs your money.
bargain.
And it's tax deductible. There are documents in here, bills of sale, or bills of lading, and inventory, or musters of ships and correspondence and so forth. And it's really very, very informative. Yes, sir.
So in real life and history, did anybody really, was there a scapegoat? Was there anybody that did?
The scapegoat turned out to be the current, actually.
No, I mean, did the government,
Somebody
the British government actually?
There's always, whenever a Royal Navy ship would wreck, there is always a court-martial. It's standard.
Yeah, so
you
we
know.
got a couple more.
It's almost like a
And
court of
So
inquiry.
on April 1st, April Fool's Day, actually, they had made it back to Port Royal, and they did have a court-martial on board the Convert, and the Bill goes into that in some detail, I think, in the book, and in the little book, the whole court-martial is published there. But finally, it's
I'll have to read the book.
it's attributed to a strong current, setting them far to the northward of their reckoning. And other ships that had come to rescue, like HMS Success, came 6 weeks, later to help the survivors and to, carry things away. The people on board that ship did testify in the court-martial that they could be set out of their reckoning too. And actually there's modern drift buoy data, if you will. Remember, I did a PhD dissertation, and there are like eddies, and there are things that happen, where there can be strange currents in the sea.
And currents at sea, I've been going to sea all my life, and currents at sea can change not direction, but subtle direction and strength with weather. So what you think you're gonna be set to the north with a half a knot of current, if the weather is bad, it could be set to the northeast with a knot and a half of current.
Bill, and there was someone here on the island who was, and I can't remember precisely what he said, but I think it was something like, after a strong south wind, when it shifts to the northward, ships kind of get sucked up towards the reef, and I can say that right in that area around the channel, there's like 5 ships right, almost on top of each other.
And there is, and there is a cut in the
For
reef
different
that
time periods,
that dive boats go out and fishing boats and so forth go out. So the
Did any
trick
of the
is to find the
survivors-
cut. Start.
Did any of the survivors settle here?
That's an interesting question. I don't believe so. But
Well, I asked the old timers, some of the old timers I would talk to would mix it up with other shipwrecks, and they would tell me about families that, had descended from them, but it was really not exactly the same wreck, so it would kind of meld together. So there's no real, solid evidence that anybody stayed, but it would not have been a bad thing to do,
now you all should know that until Peggy put this down on paper and it became kind of the definitive history of this event. Previous to that, all it was oral histories, and you know how that can change. And she did a fair amount of research with talking to the local folks here, and that's also in this little book. and some of the stories of, you know, the ship's name was wrong, the how many, well, they always knew it was 10 because it was called the Wreck of the 10 Sail. But the local lore had changed the story over the years. And I mean, there was really no written history here until, what, 1900?
Yeah, but he kept it alive, you know, and there was a commercial, Commissioner Chris did talk to some of the folks, you know, at East End, and they were telling him they thought, some people said they thought that, you know, like a fort had been built out on, you know, on the sand spit. But he'd heard from Artelico, you know, the story of the wreck of the 10 Sail, and he said, you know, there's no doubt where the wreck of the 10 Sail happened. It was on that very spot, you know, where there's cannons in the sea. And some of those cannons, Bill, there's probably 13 still in the sea there. People lived in 10 of them. And so, I mean, in the last 20 years, no more cannons have been lifted, you know. If you're gonna do that, you have to have a plan of conservation.
Dr. Denton, there's always been the rumors that royalty was on board, and that's why the island was tax exempt and all that. I assume that was all myth.
Well, we haven't found any, you know, evidence that there was a personage on board.
And
But, you know.
I must compliment you, Mr. White, in reading his book. Your knowledge of the rigging, the sail, and it was just extraordinary and delightful reading.
After 8 or 9 of them, it gets easier. Plus, I have sailed on a square rig, and you know, so I kind of know how it works.
Who are the local inhabitants? Who are the local inhabitants?
Well, it's interesting. They were just as much of a mixed bag as what there are now living here. They came from Jamaica. Some of them were escaped slaves. Some of them were sailors who jumped ship. They were every color from as white as you can imagine to as dark as night. They were pirates that went ashore. Of course, they all made their living mostly from the sea, so they had to have some knowledge of that or learn it. They were turtling and fishing and so on. Some were farming, but they were a total mixed bag of Spanish and English and African slaves and Jamaicans.
Did they all pitch in to help rescue the...
Not all of them, but a lot of them did, as to the best of their ability. Now, remember that hurricane that came through really put the kibosh on almost anything. Think about, you know, a week after Ivan. Well, if you're in West Bay, think about 3 months after Ivan. But think about you know, a few weeks after Ivan, what this place was looking. We're in the 21st century. They were in the late 18th century, and they had nothing. They had to rebuild their boats. They had no livestock. Their crops were gone. Their houses were, for the most part, gone. They didn't clock storms then the way we do now. So, but from the damage and the descriptions of it, it was clearly a 150 mile storm.
Can I just make a comment? The sister book to that little one is the Corbett's 1802 Census, which can give you an idea of, you know, where settlements were on the island at that time. There were like, at that time, there were a little over just under 1,000 people living on the island. Half of them were enslaved. And so, you know, that's another book that you can buy in the shop there and learn, you know,
It's
where
on
the
the
people
shelf out
lived
there.
and where they came from.
Yes, Ken.
So Valentine's back in London and is ready to go on your next book. Is he a continuous character?
The next book focuses on the American Navy, but during the War of 1812, you may recall, I know you were very young then, but you may recall that the Americans were fighting the British. Valentine is going to turn up as a shipmaster in the Royal Navy.
And he started, interestingly, in that other book, he didn't mention it exactly, it has to do with the mutiny on the Bounty and the, you know, his previous
Right.
adventure was quite a good one too.
Any other questions? If any of you choose to part with the 16 CI and buy the blue book, I will be happy to sign it. I'm sure that if you were to part with 42 CI, is that what it is for this one?
12. It's clearly the better bargain.
I'm trying to help you out here,
I'm
Frank.
just teasing you.
I'm sure that you could even
They make good
impose
companions.
upon Peggy's good
They make good
disposition to
companions.
write her name on it for you. So, having said all of that, the bookshop is open and they're ready to take your money, and
Yes, I'd just like to say a couple of things, which is, first of all, Bill, thank you so much, for being here today. And for time in writing this book and sharing everything with us. We are very grateful here at the museum.
well, it's a pleasure.
And then the second thing is just want to let everybody know that Bill is ready. There'll be a little table out there, and he will personalize your book, if you purchase it. And we also have refreshments. We have some wine and cheese and vegetables and things like that. So we hope that you'll have a little party out there and socialize and enjoy. Getting back to our next speaker series. Okay.